word for the user student. And so we can see there's actually a file inside that directory called noperms. And if we cat the contents of that as root, because we can see this file has no permissions. So as the user student, I cannot do a cat canrm / noperms because the permission that's required to read the contents of a file is read on the file itself. And the file itself has no permissions whatsoever. So we can't read it. Can we write to it? Let's see. I'm going to use the echo command, which is basically a command that just prints something to the screen. I'm just going to echo test, and I'm going to redirect that into the file to see if I can write to it. I can't write to it. So I can't write to it. I can't read it. But let's see if I can delete it. Now note that the file noperms has 0 permissions. The user, the group, and other, no one can do anything to this file. They cannot read the contents of it, they cannot modify the file, and they cannot execute the file. So the question is, can we delete this file? Let's see if that worked. Sudo ls tacl canrm. Yes, we can delete the file. Now that's usually one of the most confusing permissions problems to a lot of new users. How are we able to delete a file that we have no permissions to? We can't write to the file. We can't even read the contents of the file, yet we have the permissions to remove the file from the machine. And the reason for that is because the permissions on a file have nothing to do with whether or not you can actually remove a file. The permissions for whether or not you can remove or add a file to a directory are on the directory the file is contained in. And if we look at the canrm directory here, we have write and execute on the directory. So although we can't see what's in the directory because we don't have read, we do have execute, which means we can traverse the directory. And we do have write, which means we can add stuff to the directory or remove stuff. For instance, I could say touch canrm / student_file, and I get no error. Now I can't do an ls-tacl of canrm and see that file, but I could echo, this is my file, and I could write something to it. Forgot a quote there. So I still can't see that that file is in the directory, but if I cat canrm / student_file, we see the contents of that file. So I can add contents to the directory, I can create new files, I can delete the files that are in there, I can even edit new files that I create, but because I had no permissions on the file itself, I couldn't modify the previous file. Let's look at another example here. So group perms. So in this group perms directory, it's owned by the user root, which has read, write, execute, and the group UMBC. Well, let's see who's a member of the UMBC group. The command that I usually like to use for that is getInt. So getInt, it's short for get entry. So getInt group UMBC. So we can see there, the last field tells us what users are members of that group. So student is a member, which is who we are currently logged in as, and then another user called user 70. So the group UMBC has full read, write, execute to this directory, which means they can see what's inside of it, they can delete files and add new files to the directory, and they can traverse it. But for other, no other users can do anything inside this directory. They cannot traverse it, they cannot do an ls or see what's inside of it, and they cannot delete or add anything to it. So let's do an ls on group perms. And we see there's a file called group file. Let's do a long listing on that. So this file is also owned by the group UMBC, but the user root. The user has read, write, no execute, and the group has read, and all other have read. So that's the group file. So let's see what's inside that group file. It just says that this is a group file. So as the user student, let's see what I can do. Can I create a file inside this directory? Yes. I can create a new file. Now, can I write to the group file? Can I add something to it? Let's see. Echo. No, I cannot. So I have read, write, execute on the directory, but I can't write to that file, even though the group ownership is owned by UMBC, and I'm a member of that group. And that's because the permissions to modify a file are on the file itself. We need write permissions on the file in order to modify it, but we don't have that. We only have read permissions. So the only thing group can do with that file is modify it, or we cannot modify it. But we can remove it. Now it is no longer there. So although we didn't have the permission to change the contents, we had the permissions to completely remove it from the system, because the permission to delete a file is on the directory that the file is contained in, not on the file itself. That's important to remember. Let's look at the next example. So next I have a directory here called no one read, and the directory is owned by the user student and the group student, and the permissions for the user who owns it are just execute, group just execute, and all other people on the system is just execute. So will I be able to do an ls of this directory? No. I can't see what's inside of it. No one can. So let's see what's inside of it as the user root. I'm going to do a sudo ls tech-l on no one read. So we see there is one file in there. It's owned by student, the user student, and the group student. And the permissions are read, write, read, write, read, write. So that means that, let's see if another user can modify or delete this file. So let's test that. I'm going to do sudo su Joel. So I'm going to switch to this Joel user. So I'm not student anymore. So let's see if I can do an ls on no one read. No, I still can't. But we know this file is inside that directory called file. So let's see if I can read it. Cat no one read file. Yes, I can read the file. Even though all I have is execute on the directory as other, because I'm Joel right now, I'm not student, I can still read the contents of the file, because read on a directory is not required to see the contents of a file. It's only required to basically do an ls in the directory and see what files are inside the directory. So I can see what's inside the file. Let's see if I can edit it. Echo, this is Joel. Yes, I can edit the file as well. Now let's see if I can remove it. No, I cannot remove it. And that is because I do not have write permissions on the directory. Although the file itself, which was, if I do a sudo ls-tech-l, Joel does not have sudo privileges. The file itself has write for other, and that is why we can modify it, but we cannot delete the file. Next, let's look at this next directory called no1rm. And so that directory has read and execute for student, student, and other. So everyone on the system essentially can read what's inside of that directory and traverse that directory. So let's see what's inside of it. We have one file inside called can't delete. Let's see what's inside of that. Let's see what the contents are of that file. The contents basically just says can't delete this file. But why couldn't we delete it? The file has read, write, and execute permissions for the user, group, and other. So everyone in the entire system can read that file, write to it, and execute it. So if I said echo, this is student, and then try to cat that. We can write to it. We could even execute it if it was a script. Obviously, we can read from it. But can we delete it? rm, no1rm. No, we cannot delete it. And that is because we do not have write on the directory. The last example here is this file called unotmodify. And that one is owned by the user student and the group student, and it's just a file. So the user student has read on it. So can we read it? Yes. We are both the user and the group who owns the file. Let's try and modify that file. Echo, this is my file. No, it's our file. We own it. Owned by user student, owned by group student, but we can't modify it. But we can read it. Let's switch users to Joel. So now I'm the user Joel. Let's see if I can modify it now. Yes. So the user Joel can modify it, but the user who owns the file, and they're also in the group that owns the file, can't. Even though every other user on the entire system can. And this is because of what I mentioned earlier about the most specific permission applies. So when it's looking to see whether or not you have permission to do whatever it is you're requesting to do, it first looks at the user permissions. It's going to see, in this case, do you have permission as the user student to modify this file? The first thing it's going to look at are the user permissions from left to right. The user permissions say you only have the permission to read the file. You don't have write. So because you matched the user who owns the file, it's going to look at that permission set, and it will not look at the rest of the permission sets at all. So the most specific permission set applies. So the first one that it matches. If it matches user first, it won't look at group or other permissions. If it matches, if you're not the user who owns it, but you're in the group who owns it, it'll look at group permissions, but it will not look at other. But if you're not in the user, if you're not the user or the owner, and you're not in the group who owns the file, then it will apply or look at the other permissions. So that is why any other user on the system can modify this file, but the user who owns the file cannot. And hopefully that kind of covers most of the individual or confusing situation or confusing permissions situations that you may encounter. And although it may seem a little bit daunting at first, if you just play around with some directories and files, create some directories, apply different unique permission sets, maybe create a couple different groups or users, and just kind of play around with it and try it out, you'll probably find that you're going to get a good feel with it within no time. It's really all just about practicing and muscle memory and just getting your hands on the keyboard and making sure that you understand exactly how it works.